All right, welcome everybody to TagOne's inaugural webinar. We're going to give it probably another minute or two before we dive deep into some of the content here. Just a quick overview on what we're going to do and an introduction to the system. If you haven't used Zoho's webinar software before, on your left you should see a Q&A button, polls as well, and I think there's an area where you can raise your hand. So throughout the presentation, I'll be asking at various times just to get your feedback and answer some polls. Will help us understand where different people sit in their perspectives or where they're at in the transparency journey. And then if we've got time, hopefully the goal is to have about 10, 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. If you've got questions, just type them in along the way and we'll get to those at the end. My brain's not big enough or smart enough to stop in the middle and kind of ask questions and continue on, but just ask them in the Q&A section, type them in, and then I'll read them aloud and we'll answer them at the end of the session if we have some time there. So, Len, do we have you on the line? Len is here. He's going to unmute, and then we will probably get started in just a moment. All right, Len, do we have you? Len, you there? Len.
Hello. Sorry, I was having some audio problems.
No problem. So, all right, quick introduction. My name is Joe Witte. I'm the VP of Ecosystems and Partnerships here at TagOne. And we've got Len Monheit with us here. Excited to have you, Len. And we're going to talk about how best practices in blockchain are delivering dietary supplement transparency. It's quite a lot to cover for sure. Len, tell us a little bit about yourself. For those of you that don't know Len, he's a passionate guy. He's been in the industry for a long time, wearing a lot of different hats, from regulatory to media components. Tell us what drove yourself and the company to start Trust Transparency Center and what your vision is for the company.
Absolutely. First of all, it's great to be on this webinar with you, Joe. Thanks for the opportunity. My background is chemistry, biochemistry, and prior to getting into the natural products industry, I was running a contract analytical lab and saw varying degrees of quality and competency throughout the industry back in the late 90s. Did get into the media side and did a lot of focus on ingredients and supply chain. Over the course of the last couple of years, I've joined my business partner, Scott Steinford, in Trust Transparency Center. And as the name implies, everything we do is focused on trust transparency. We say trust transparency, not trust and transparency, because they're interwoven, they're synergistic, and transparency leads to that holy grail, which is consumer trust and trust in ourselves as an industry. So we are driving towards that in any of our operations, whether those are the ingredient associations we operate or the practices and the processes we get involved with companies.
Awesome. So what we want to do before we get started is just talk about what we're going to talk about today. So a lot of different topics. One, what are some of the major supply chain issues in the industry? How do these issues creep into our businesses and what are the problems they can cause? What is transparency? There's a lot of talk about that and why we should consider being more transparent in our businesses. What internal best practices we can integrate to minimize risk and improve efficiency. What this whole blockchain thing is and how it can impact us. A little bit about our software solution. General about what software is and how they can help us and change behaviors and avoid mistakes. And ultimately, how supply chain transparency can differentiate a company in the market. So diving right in, on the left, you guys can see a poll. I want to ask you guys, if you could answer the first two questions, how important is supply chain and product transparency to your organization at this time? And maybe what stage your company is at also. So I'm going to start the first two. great. And I don't know if you guys can see the results, but it looks like, 4.8. Most companies, it's either 4 or 5 stars. It's really important to you guys. Now I'm going to start the second poll, which is what stage you guys are at in integrating supply chain transparency. So as we're going through this poll, Len, what do you see as the current state of the dietary supplement industry? What are some of the growth opportunities and some of the key challenges?
Well, I mean, I think this poll is interesting in that companies realize it's important, but their efforts are a little bit lagging. I think it's really, really challenging to understand, and every company is on its own transparency journey. We've got new regulations that are enforced erratically. We've got very complex supply chains. We've got data handling capabilities that are increasing, but it's burdensome. So, I mean, there's a lot to wrestle with if you're a company within the industry, whether you're a manufacturer, contract manufacturer, or a brand, or even a supplier. You've got a lot of things you're wrestling with as you take on this nebulous concept of transparency. But it is a journey, and every company's on their own journey.
And I know that there is one statistic we were talking about before about just how many brands there are on, let's say, Amazon, and how a lot of them are just flat out aren't meeting label claim. What kind of challenges does that present to the industry as a whole? And so you may have some good companies out there that are doing it right. Like how to combat that?
Well, I think that you're right. There's companies that have been around of all sizes that are doing it exceptionally well. They've got this down. One of the things that the internet has done is it created another low barrier to entry with regulations and with expectations for consumers. We had started to raise the bar on entry in the industry, but the internet has lowered that bar, and a company could go to business being ignorant of really what they need to do in order to comply. We've also got the issue of a company can go to market without physically touching their product. It can be produced and it could be stored for them. They don't know what their responsibilities are. So these are opportunities because with a little tweaking, they can get it right. And the technology capabilities for them to get it right are emerging on the scene.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right. I think it's encouraging. There are opportunities to grow. I mean, I think another area that's really challenging for the industry as a whole is just the complexity of supply chain. I mean, when you look at how many different players are in that process from start to finish, and like you said, somebody whose name may be on a bottle may not even see the ingredients or product before it ends up in the consumer. How complex is this process, and how much is the complexity, do you feel like, contributes to some of the, negative, feelings and sentiments towards dietary supplements today?
Well, I'll start with the data point. And Nutrition Business Journal and Next recently arrived at a number of about 40% under 40% of consumers trust supplements. I think that there's other polls that show it a little bit better. This slide that you're seeing right now is a simplified dietary supplement supply chain. There is so much more going on and so many touch points, and that's a tough story to tell. But it is a story to tell because you can get an ingredient from one corner of the world, an excipient from another, a harvested product from Americas, and various processing and aggregating steps that all lead to that bottle that a consumer gets. There's a huge opportunity to be able to tell that story about that complexity, but this complexity makes it challenging. And you'll see that right in the middle there is that contract manufacturing box, and that's problematic because most brands have very limited visibility back through the supply chain, through that contract manufacturing step, and most raw material companies are not necessarily the right part of the equation as product gets aggregated and brought into contract manufacturing. And even if you're a branded ingredient, you can get displaced by a decision that's made at procurement. So it's challenging both ways in the supply chain.
And just to even add to that, knowing that it's a global supply chain, now the FDA has implemented the FSBP policy, what kind of pressure do you see that's going to put on companies? Is it significant? And how do they need to improve their process in order to manage the FSBP policy?
Well, FSB, the Food Safety Modernization Act is mostly about managing risk and identifying the risks in your supply chain and of your suppliers. The FSBP program focuses on foreign suppliers, which means that part of the supply chain is not exempt. So there are inspections that are happening both internationally and domestically. The expectations of the FDA are increasing. You have this under control and appropriately risk managed. But there are companies, despite the fact that compliance for all companies is mandated as of last year, there are companies that are still negligent in this area. There are companies that are still figuring it out. And FDA has not been very prescriptive. They've just said you have to have the plan, and it has to address these safety issues, including allergens. There will be increasing pressure to have a good system in place that seamlessly handles your supply chain, especially your foreign suppliers.
Yep, and I mean, you touched upon with that, what is motivating transparency? How do you define transparency today, Len, as it applies to supply chain management?
Like I said, every company is on their own transparency journeys. It depends on where you start, some of your legacy, some of your history. Transparency is disclosing some things that may be uncomfortable in the interest of satisfying the increasing need of your supply chain partners, underlying partners, to do better, longer-term, more viable and successful business with you so that consumers will trust your products at the end.
Sure. So you talked a little bit about the FDA's role in hey, we just need to be better in our supply chain process to deal with policies, whether it's state attorneys general or FDA. But you touched a little bit, but talk a little more about how consumers are fitting into this transparency model.
Well, there's been a lot of negativity about some of the big businesses, whether that's bank data breaches, Volkswagen and their emissions manipulation. So all of these are leading to an overall of distrust. And then I think that there is this, where do you get your information? Can you trust the internet? I mean, we've heard the litany of fake news. You can manipulate headlines. And consumers are finding it increasingly difficult to discern what is trustworthy, but they're expecting, demanding, and getting better information because it's very difficult, it's increasingly difficult to keep things hidden, keep skeletons hidden. These things will out.
Yeah, and so when consumers don't trust a whole industry, that's bad for everybody, right? And so what we're going to talk about predominantly today is that operational efficiency, and now with new technologies and capabilities, how we can start to differentiate, hey, these are the good brands, here's how we can prove it, right? And these are the ones that maybe aren't as sophisticated or just flat out don't care. So, Len, a little bit on, you guys have got your scoring system with your company, Trust Transparency Center. What do you see as the major enhancers, like why companies are moving towards transparency?
Well, first of all, 20 years in this industry, or 25, I'm a strong advocate for the industry and really love some of the best practices. And we at Trust Transparency have built a scoring system, a Trust Transparency scorecard, which talks about operational aspects, but also cultural aspects, which we figure are important in the dietary supplement industry, but in industry generally. So we start to think about enhancers of transparency and trust, okay? This is an industry with solid recent growth, solid projected growth. We have users, we have believers. These are people that are a committed audience that wants our product and wants the personalized approach. I can take control of my health. They're engaged.
Right. Yep.
We've also got amazingly vibrant and valuable stories. We've got legacy. We've got sourcing from farmers from far off. We've got mission and purpose-driven companies. We've got passion in entrepreneurs, passion in staff, passion when it comes to lobbying. We're also very well poised to be part of the e-commerce movement. Going online and being able to sell online is extremely powerful, and it's reaching consumers where they are. They're online. And we're part of that health and wellness dialogue. We're doing good for society and good for people. So these are all the enhancers we have as an industry.
And what are some companies that are doing it right?
Well, I mean, I could probably list 10, 12, 14, but of recent, and one goes back maybe 15 years in their program, I would say Gaia Herbs in the Know Your Herbs program was one of the first to really go back and track the lot numbers and the harvest and field conditions of some of the herbs and botanicals within their product line.
Yep.
So that's a good example. Another example, a little bit more recently, would be Megafood. And
Yep.
part of their transparency initiative was actually to put cameras on their manufacturing operation so that there was visibility and transparency on their process and manufacturing. So those are two examples right within the industry.
Yeah, and we spoke to the leadership at Sabinza and just how they're focused on sustainability, working with the farmers, giving them fair prices. There's a lot of it's like when I came out of the expo out west, Natural Products Expo out west, I actually came encouraged that there's a lot of companies that really care. So I think that there's going to be this shift in movement as it's just really about letting the consumers know which ones care and which ones maybe don't. And I think we're probably pretty close to that. And kind of on that, what are some of the challenges to integrating transparency and the detractors?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got very opaque supply chains. There's a little bit of a black box and a definite opacity at contract manufacturers. Sometimes third-party testing labs, that's an island of information, and companies may not vet or even have third-party analytical labs doing their work. We definitely get involved in hyperbole when it comes to our claims, and that leads to distrust. There's this general distrust of corporation, the fake news aspect that I spoke of a little while ago. We've got a very convoluted regulatory environment. It's not pharma, it's not food, it's deliberately not that way, and that it's misspoken, misrepresented, and so that ambiguity doesn't necessarily always stand in our support. And where our detractors are, they're extremely vocal.
Yep, that makes sense. And so, in order to help companies that want to move towards this transparency, you guys developed a checklist. And of course, this is just, you guys have a very thorough process. Talk about what drove this and how this is helping companies start to take a look at themselves and their process to become, better and more efficient, more transparent.
Yeah, so the background to this is the understanding that there are 15,000 plus brands on Amazon, 160,000 SKUs. There are new companies that don't have the background and the engagement with the industry that some of the legacy companies have, and that a company can go to market without physical presence in brick and mortar, and that there are things that are absolutely fundamental that are contained within the regulations, but there's no real how-to for the industry and some of these entrepreneurs. So that led us to develop this checklist, and there's about 15, 16 items. Most of them are very logical if you think about it. They're not being complied with in many cases because there's general ignorance, and these companies either want to take a quick path to market, or they really don't know that these are expectations and behaviors and accountabilities. So that led to the development of this list.
Okay.
We know that there's shortcuts being taken. We know that there's great contract manufacturers being used. We also know that there are ones that are taking the shortcuts to bring a lower product to market, lower price product.
Yep, that makes sense. And so when you're starting to talk to these companies or you have relationships with a lot of them, what do you think is the main reason that drives them to be more transparent? And I'm going to also poll the audience on that now. So I'm going to start that poll. What's driving your company? And so what are you seeing, Len, as people are answering the question?
So I think that the more complicated the supplier's supply chain, they need ways of organizing it, but it also contributes to their story. The brands that want to differentiate, that want to attract that emerging supplement buyer, know that it's knowing what ingredients are in your products, knowing how products are prepared and produced, how they're grown. So there's an emerging population of supplement consumers that expect to know and to be able to see that information. So I think brands are strongly positioning around that. And then as number two says, there's companies that just recognize that it's the right thing to do, and there's data that shows that trust and intangibles is leading to increased market valuations. So there's a direct correlation, and that's part of the ROI. Market capitalization is being driven by financial performance, sure, but it's also these intangibles.
That makes sense. So when we look at the operational component of being transparent, I mean, there's a lot that goes into it. We talked about, meeting FDA, FSVP standards, i.e., hey, you got to check the box and make sure we're not getting in trouble with Big Brother. There's just a lot of documentation and data. especially with all the certifications that come around. Everything that's like, oh, this is going to make it so much easier, rarely is. If you've got, 100 different SKUs or even 10 different SKUs, how many different ingredients that may go into that? It can get complex fast, and then you're tracking transactions in and out, who's buying, who's selling, who are your suppliers, who are your suppliers' suppliers, where did that come from? Ultimately, to make a product safe. And then at the end, like, all right, well, how are we going to get all these people on our team, whether you're a 10-person team or a 500 or 5,000-person team, squared away to manage this process? Do you think it's unrealistic to expect companies to get this and execute this flawlessly, or can this be done?
I think it can be done. I think in the past it was haphazard despite the best of intentions. Mm-hmm. I think that with converging technologies, it's now feasible, and I think FDA and others are recognizing that it should be the expectation.
Right.
You talked about two aspects there. You've got reams and reams of information and documentation. Systems are set up for that. Then you've got the data handling, processing, that aspect of it that's going to trigger your actions and your subsequent processes. And connecting those two areas, companies haven't figured out generally, but the expectation in general is that companies will have this under control.
And so, you mentioned, hey, is there technologies